All right, I have 2:35, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's see, make sure we're on the right screen. All right. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining me today. And I'll start by apologizing for the really long presentation title. The too long didn't read version of it is really integrating applications into PAM. And I think this might be the longest title Identiverse this year that doesn't include passkeys in it, so I've got that going for me. So I'm Ken Robertson. I work for Fifth Third Bank in their Privileged Access Management team, and I have over 20 years of experience in information technology, and I'd say more than half of that's in the identity space. And so I'm really thrilled to be talking to you today about one of my favorite areas of identity, which is PAM. All right, so who's this talk for? Well, it's for PAM practitioners, people like myself that do the day-to-day work in the PAM space, either designing, onboarding programs and things like that, working with application teams. It's also for the PAM, say, product owners that are trying to figure out ways to improve the maturity of their PAM program. Definitely for application owners, they're looking to reduce risk and improve the security of their applications. And it's also for IT auditors that want to learn a little bit more about the PAM space and what we can do. All right. Hopefully what you'll get out of this today is a better understanding of where credentials hide in the PAM and applications, and then learn some steps to detect and manage those credentials. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about PAM maturity here. And so let's make sure I'm on the right slide. Yep. So the agenda, so the PAM maturity, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can build out the maturity of your program by onboarding applications. We'll talk a little bit about non-human accounts and secrets. We're also going to cover some of the, basically as you're building out the program, asking the right questions. We'll talk a little bit about PAM and IG integration, implementation plans, the challenges, takeaways. I'm also going to talk, I'm going to be talking about applications in a general sense because, there's so many different types of applications out there. So really, this talk's going to apply to any of the applications that you might have, whether they're on-prem, SaaS solutions, in the cloud, homegrown, developed, all those will apply. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the maturity here. Sorry, these slides are off a little bit, so just bear with me for a second. Okay, so integrating applications and secrets is one of the most difficult parts of managing a PAM program. This is definitely not where you start. This is going to require some advanced skills from your PAM team. Definitely a lot of planning. This is not the low-hanging fruit. This slide shows a little bit of what I'm trying to describe here. So if you look in the lower left-hand corner, local admins, directory accounts, directory admins, that's typically where PAM programs will start. These are pretty standard. They're less difficult to onboard. They're less complex to manage, and therefore they're pretty straightforward. They're kind of standardized. But when you look up into the upper right-hand corner, the applications, which we're going to talk about today, they're definitely more difficult to onboard, complex to manage, and just generally it's very time-consuming on the PAM team. All right, so we'll start off by asking some of the right questions to build out our PAM program. And the first question you're going to ask is really, how do you define a privileged application account? And you might think, well, that's pretty straightforward. That's an easy question. But really, when you start looking at applications, it becomes very difficult. When you think back to that previous slide, when you're talking about local administrators, directory accounts, those are pretty standard, straightforward use cases that PAM traditionally takes care of. When you start looking at the applications, it becomes much more complex. So what you want to do is you want to start building out some use cases of how the accounts are being used in the application. So and then take those use cases and then compare it to your enterprise policy for privileged accounts. Do they match up? And if they don't, then you're going to have to add to your plan here to make revisions to your enterprise policy. Next thing you're going to ask is, what is the source of truth for applications in my environment? Like, who is the owner of the application? Who's the support team? What's the risk level of it? These are questions you need to know as you start planning and trying to prioritize the applications. Now, most organizations have a configuration management database, otherwise known as a CMDB. If you're not familiar with CMDB, it's basically just a place to store IT assets and information about it. And it's generally easy to retrieve information and do searches against it. The problem is that a lot of organizations have difficulty maintaining that CMDB. And so because your program is going to be relying on that data, you're going to probably have to take it upon yourself to make sure that it's actually being maintained. And I know this is not part of the responsibility of the PAM team, but like I said, as you're trying to make this happen, you'll probably have to influence and drive those updates. And then finally on this slide, also talk about have a place to inventory all the privileged accounts. And so you might be thinking, well, that's my PAM tool. But think about at this point, when you're doing early on interviews, these accounts are probably not going to be able to be managed the same way you're managing other accounts in the PAM space. So either you're going to have a separate area in your PAM tool to separate those, or you might be able to track them in your IGA tool. But it's just important right now to think about, as you're building out that plan, that you're going to have this challenge. All right. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the accounts that you could consider onboarding into PAM. And then break glass accounts, those are pretty common in just about every application, including your SaaS solutions. Then obviously database strings or database connections, there's going to be credentials that you use for that. API credentials, you may be consuming a REST API. You might actually be giving a REST API out to be consumed. So those credentials have to be managed. Administration consoles, those are pretty common for doing configuration. And so I see a lot of RPA accounts that have extremely high privileges because these accounts are doing repetitive administration work. And the last thing on this list is application secrets. This could be a lot of different things. This could be credentials to your pipeline. It could be things that it could be like encryption keys. So the point here is that this list is not everything. This is supposed to be a thought starter when you start talking to your application teams. These are some common ones that you can ask them about, but really you're going to interview your teams to find out what is it, how does your application work, and what kind of controls that we're going to have to add to manage those. Okay, and then finally close the gaps. And so what I mean here is that you want to make sure that your PAM team recognizes when new applications come into your environment. So make sure that for in-house developed applications that PAM is part of your software delivery lifecycle. Also meet with your enterprise architecture team and add a step into their process for PAM review. And like I said, the idea is so that the PAM team will know when a new application comes in, so they're not going to try to chase it down at a later point. All right. So nowadays you can't really talk about PAM without mentioning IGA. And so identity governance and PAM are definitely critical components to your security strategy. And since I'm at Identiverse, I imagine that most of you agree with that. The key here is that a lot of vendors are actually adding, in the PAM space, they're adding IGA type functionality to their tools. And so there's a lot of conversation about the convergence. And so this slide really, I'm not addressing the convergence piece, although you probably should be aware of it and do some research about what the opportunities are there. But what I'm talking about here is actually from an organizational standpoint. So when your IGA teams, and I'd say it this way, I'd say the places that have the biggest challenges are when your IGA and PAM teams are siloed. These components are supposed to work together. So you should probably consider something like having cross-functional teams, or at least a few people dedicated to actually making this type of integration work. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the implementation plans. And so this whole presentation up to now basically is a breakdown of this slide. And so as you can see, there's a lot of planning that has to go in before you actually start bringing any of the applications in. The inventory that you have to collect, the categorization of the privileged accounts, you're basically doing all this stuff to educate yourself about the applications and how they work. Because the important part here is you're going to have to build a roadmap to bring these in. And so this roadmap could be 6 months, it could be a year or years, depending on how many applications you're trying to onboard. But once you have that familiarity with the applications and you understand the risk levels and how they work, then you'll be able to build that plan. All right, so the next piece here is discovering the accounts. And so you can't manage what you don't know. And so you're going to have to get these accounts basically a way that you can identify them and so that you can start the planning for the onboarding. And so the way you do this, and so this would probably be a very manual step at first, is you're going to interview the application teams, because really the PAM team, you're not an expert on all these things. You have to talk to someone that does know some things about them. So it's going to be kind of like, say, like an interview for the meeting with the Bobs. How about for Office Space? Any Office Space fans here? Okay, you're gonna sit down with the application teams and say, what would you say you do here, right? And you could go back to that list earlier and say, here's some ideas. Does your application do any of these things? And then as you're going through that, you'll find out that you'll find out about use cases that you hadn't documented before. Let me tell you a quick story about one of my experiences. I went through a process where I was interviewing this app team, and it was a very detailed. They had a lot of PAM accounts. Worked really hard to get them all into the PAM system, and get the credentials rotating and all those things. So it was a lot of work. But once we got it done, then a few months after that, I was running a usage report. I noticed no one was using any of these credentials that we spent all this time onboarding. And then it turns out, so I went back to the application team and I said, what's going on here? Well, it turns out that there was an operations team that did a lot of the work also. They had separate credentials that they were using to log in, which basically bypassed all the PAM controls that I put in place. So this is an example. You can learn from my mistake that you need to make sure that you're interviewing. I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't ask the right people. So, and again, you don't want to. You want to make sure you're interviewing the engineers. Don't interview the guy who collects the specifications and then carries them over to the engineers. That guy doesn't know what's going on. So, I think the thing that you have to consider here is that it does take time to have these interviews, but as you do more of them, you'll have a better understanding of how the apps are in your environment. And really, the last thing on this slide that I want to mention is building out self-service for application teams. And so you're going to need some tools to work with. You're going to need like request forms. You're going to probably need to manage Active Directory groups. You're probably going to have to do some type of automated provisioning, right? Well, when you think about it, that's IGA, right? And those are the IGA things. And this is, again, an example of why it's so important to have that integration with the IGA team. All right, so now we're at the point where we got to define some policies about how these accounts are going to be managed. And there's a little bit of difference for workflows. You have to look at the different use cases for human and non-human, but also the different teams. Like for example, a workflow for a regular administrator might need an approval or two, depending on the type of account. But you also don't want a workflow for your operations team, to wait for an approval at 3 o'clock in the morning. So you have to take these into account when you build out the use cases. The rest of these pieces I think are pretty straightforward. The password rotation frequency, complexity, those type of things. I am going to mention the last thing here is the session recording. And I think this can be tricky depending on the use cases that you have in your environment. So, I've been doing this long enough that I recognize that, session recordings, they don't get used that much, right? And so to apply session recording across all of your credentials, that might not be necessary. So you think about this. There's going to be certain accounts where you've set up with least privilege, right? So you know exactly what that account can and can't do. So if someone checks out that account and say it just restarts a service, stops the service, it probably doesn't add a lot of value to record that. That's exactly what that account can do. It can't do anything else. Now, obviously, other accounts, like a root administrator that can do a lot of things, maybe that's where you want to focus your effort into recording. All right. So now we're at the point. So we need to onboard the accounts, and so every PAM tool has ways to do this, different ways to do it. But bulk uploading, automation through maybe an API, or manual uploading through a GUI, right? The next thing they have, a lot of PAM tools have discovery. And my comment on discovery is that for applications, it's not that effective. And it's because the applications are very complex. Every one of them is different, and the accounts are all stored differently. So maybe you'll have an application where everything's in an LDAP directory and you'll get lucky, but that's usually not the case. So I think the discovery tools on the PAM side, for applications, it's kind of difficult to use. And then I also mentioned self-service again, and in this context, the self-service is, let's try to get the application teams to do some of their own onboarding. Either through, you might have an API that you built out. You might be able to use your PAM tool API, depending on how granular you can set the controls. But again, usually PAM teams don't have limitless resources, and if you might have hundreds or thousands of applications in your environment, you really need to spread that work around. All right, and then the final step in this plan is really a phased approach to enabling accounts. And we've talked about, all right, we've put the accounts into our PAM system, but I didn't mention managing them yet. And that's because that part of the process really does take a lot of time. The application teams tend to have to make changes to their application. They might have to modify either APIs that they're calling. They might have to modify some code that's doing retrieval for automatic retrieval of accounts. So there's a lot of work on their side. But once you get them to trust the process in their lower environments, their dev environments, then you'll be able to move them into the production environments a little bit quicker. But I guess the point is change is hard, and the applications are difficult to deal with. So, and that's why this is kind of like the last step here in that process. So I've talked about a few of the challenges, and let me go ahead and talk about a few more. So you are going to break my application, right? This is what you're going to hear from the application teams. This will be the first part of the conversation. And I know I've probably heard it hundreds of times. Maybe I've heard it thousands of times. There's going to be pushback. There's going to be people that say they don't have time for it, or they're not interested in it. And that's just the way it happens. So you have to be prepared for the pushback. And so part of that is to have good have a good process with your executive team for executive support. And so why I'm saying this is that there's always ways that you can try to influence a team to do things for yourself. But really, those you might not have time to really be that influencer, right? Sometimes you just need to get work done. You're going to have to escalate. You're going to have your management talk to their management. And that's what I've seen over and over again. So I'd say the most important thing to kind of move things along is, one, you need that executive support. Two, you need even more executive support. And then three, I'll let you guess what number 3 is. All right, so resources. So this is you're going to need people from all these teams, and then some. And unfortunately, like I've mentioned before, a lot of the work is going to end up on the application team's shoulders. So if they can say no, it's going to put a stop to your program. And again, that's why the executive support is so important. And I got to move a little bit quicker here. So what does the end state look like? Well, the application team is going to no longer be concerned about the password rotations. Those accounts are going to be managed by PAM. They'll either be rotated per policy on either a time-based schedule, like 30 days, 90 days, whatever, or they'll be rotated on a policy that could be usage. Someone checked it out, someone used it. Maybe there's some type of suspicious activity in your neighborhood, in your application, and you're just going to rotate the passwords just to be on the safe side, or someone's left the application team. So again, it'd be nice for them to not have to worry about that. And then the second piece on this slide is really, now the application team no longer knows the password or secret. And this kind of gets back to like insider threats. Insider threats are real, and if you can remove this from the application team, you've reduced some of that risk, and you've reduced some of the shadow IT. All right, so here we go. So some of the takeaways. Hopefully, this helped you think about where privileged accounts hide in applications, and give you a better understanding of the difficulties that the PAM and the application teams are going to have to go through to do the onboarding. But really, if you're going to build a mature PAM program, you're going to have to do this. And again, you saw significant planning is required. But the last bullet I think is the most important, is you're going to build relationships with those application teams. They're going to give you feedback about your processes that'll help you improve the PAM program. And then hopefully, if you've done this well enough, they'll become cheerleaders for you and help bring on other applications. So it's not just the technology, but it's also the people and the processes. So with that, thank you very much. Thanks for joining me today and listening to my